U.S. wheat exports are in jeopardy after the discovery of a rogue genetically modified wheat strain. Billions in food exports are potentially at stake.
Mexico continues to be growing the market for Montana farmers and the entire U.S. wheat industry. This week, leaders from both countries met in Cancun for a special Mexico wheat trade conference.
In fact, USDA says the number of wheat farms in the country has declined by more than 40% in the last 20 years.
In the USA, price changes don't always begin where people expect them to. They don't start on store shelves, and they don't begin with shortages. Sometimes they begin with a single policy decision, one that quietly moves through the system before anyone fully notices the impact. Right now, that's exactly what's happening in the USA. A shift in trade policy has set off a chain reaction that is affecting one of the most essential components of daily life: food. And at the center of it all is something deceptively simple: wheat. In the USA, wheat is not just another agricultural product. It is a foundational commodity. It supports industries, feeds millions, and forms the backbone of everyday consumption. Bread, pasta, cereals, baked goods, these are not optional purchases. They are part of the routine fabric of life across the USA. With nearly 50 million tons of wheat produced annually, the USA appears to be one of the most self-reliant agricultural powers in the world. The scale is massive, the output is impressive, and on the surface, it suggests complete independence. But beneath that surface lies a critical detail. The USA does not just require large quantities of wheat, it requires specific types of wheat, and that distinction has shaped the entire food system. For decades, the USA has depended heavily on Canada for high-protein wheat varieties essential for bread and pasta production. In fact, approximately 90% of wheat imports into the USA come from Canada. This is not incidental. It is a deeply embedded structural dependency. Canadian wheat offers characteristics that are difficult to replicate within the USA. Its higher protein content and stronger gluten structure provide the consistency required for large-scale food manufacturing. These qualities are what give bread its structure and pasta its firmness, qualities that consumers across the U.S. expect every day. Meanwhile, much of the wheat grown in the USA is softer in composition. It is better suited for products like pastries, crackers, and general-purpose flour, rather than the high-performance flour required for staple foods. Over time, the entire supply chain in the USA adapted to this reality. Milling operations, blending systems, and production processes were all designed around the consistent availability of Canadian wheat. It became an invisible yet essential part of the USA food ecosystem, stable, reliable, and largely unnoticed, until that stability was disrupted. The turning point came when the USA imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian wheat imports. From a strategic perspective, the move was intended to strengthen negotiating power and assert economic control. It was positioned as a calculated effort to protect domestic interests within the USA. However, the practical consequences unfolded very differently. The introduction of tariffs immediately increased the cost of imported wheat entering the USA. And in a highly interconnected system, those cost increases did not remain isolated. They moved, step by step, through the entire supply chain. Importers faced higher expenses, processors adjusted their pricing structures, manufacturers recalibrated production costs. Retailers passed those increases forward, and ultimately, the impact reached consumers across the USA. Flour prices began to rise, bread prices followed. Pasta and other staple products became more expensive. Across the USA, the cost of everyday essentials started to climb, not suddenly, but steadily. What makes this situation particularly significant is that it is not driven by scarcity. The USA continues to produce large volumes of wheat. Fields across states such as Kansas, North Dakota, and Montana remain productive. Supply exists. But supply alone is not enough because the issue is not quantity, it is specialization. The USA cannot instantly replace the specific high-protein wheat it imports. Agricultural systems are shaped by climate conditions, soil quality, and crop characteristics that cannot be altered in the short term. As a result, the USA found itself facing a limitation that policy alone could not resolve. At the same time, Canada responded in a strategic and measured way. Rather than reacting with urgency, Canada accelerated its efforts to diversify export markets. Trade relationships expanded across multiple regions, including Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Among these, Mexico emerged as a key destination. Canadian wheat shipments began moving across North America, traveling through the USA, but increasingly bypassing American buyers. Instead, they continued into Mexico, where demand for high-protein wheat aligned with Canadian supply capabilities. This development carried a clear message. Trade flows are flexible, markets can adapt, and dependency is not always mutual. Beyond Mexico, Canadian exporters strengthened their presence in countries such as China and Brazil, as well as across Europe and Africa. With over 60 international markets, Canada demonstrated that its export network was both diversified and resilient. This shift highlighted a critical imbalance. While the USA relies heavily on Canadian wheat imports, Canada's reliance on the USA as an export destination is comparatively limited. Within the USA, the consequences extended beyond consumers. American wheat farmers also experienced increased pressure. The USA exports approximately 25 million tons of wheat each year, competing directly with Canada in global markets. As Canadian exports expanded into new regions, competition intensified. This led to tighter pricing conditions, reduced margins, and greater uncertainty for producers in the USA. The impact was twofold: higher costs within the domestic market, stronger competition in international markets. Together, these pressures created a more challenging environment for the USA agricultural sector. Meanwhile, within the broader USA economy, the transmission of cost increases continued in a predictable pattern. Higher input costs translated into higher production costs, which then flowed through to retail pricing. This is where economic theory becomes real-world experience. Because in the USA, food is not just another commodity, it is a critical component of stability. It influences cost of living, consumer confidence, and overall economic well-being. When disruptions occur at this level, they are felt immediately and widely. Looking at the situation as a whole, a key insight emerges. The USA entered this trade action with the assumption of leverage, the belief that access to the American market would provide a decisive advantage. However, in the case of wheat, the underlying dynamics were more complex. Leverage in global trade depends not only on size, but on interdependence. And in this instance, the USA was more dependent than anticipated. As Canada continues to expand its global partnerships and reduce reliance on any single market, the USA faces a gradual but meaningful shift. Not a sudden disruption, but a steady rebalancing, one that slowly alters influence within the global supply chain. This is not just a short-term pricing issue in the USA, it is a structural signal. It demonstrates how quickly global trade patterns can adjust when incentives change. And more importantly, it shows that once those adjustments are made, they are not easily reversed. The implications extend beyond wheat. They raise broader questions about strategy, resilience, and long-term planning within the USA. Was this approach necessary to strengthen economic positioning? Or did it reveal an underlying vulnerability within the USA system? Should essential commodities like food be used as leverage in trade negotiations? Or does the risk to domestic stability outweigh the intended benefits? At its core, this situation underscores a simple but powerful reality. A policy decision made within the USA does not remain confined to policy. It moves through industries, through supply chains, through markets, and ultimately into everyday life across the USA. That is where its true impact is felt. So now the question becomes yours to answer. Did the USA make a strategically sound decision? Or did the USA underestimate the consequences of disrupting a critical supply chain? Share your perspective in the comments. If you found this analysis insightful, consider liking the video so it reaches a wider audience across the USA. Subscribe for more in-depth, data-driven insights into how decisions in the USA shape the realities of everyday life. And I'll see you in the next one.